So today we're going to take a look at a book stack for exploring the idea of how iterative processes, trying, failing, refining, trying again, failing, refining, this sort of thing can be, in a sense, truth revealing of the best way to do something. The stack is 5 books, which run from most theoretical, starting with the selfish gene, to most practical, ending with atomic habits, with a 6th book for balance reasons. The general, sort of principle of how this works is you try, you fail, you repeat. The best example of this is evolution, where all the trials are completely random, and over time and through thousands of generations, you get very large and pronounced effects insofar as evolution goes. An example of a shorter term effect was there was this case where there's this volcano and it was dormant, and all the mice in the area around it were largely brown. And then after the volcano erupted, the ground was covered in igneous rock, which is black, and gradually all the mice turned black. Now, were they turning black because they knew to turn black genetically? No. The idea was all the mice that were brown tended to get hunted off, and all the ones that had genetic mutations to become black tended to do a little bit better. And over the course of 50 years, all the mice went from being predominantly brown to predominantly black. So this is an example of an iterative process, because in evolution, it's over generations that you have each iteration. Science is a form of an iterative process where you develop a theory, and you hold that theory as true until you can find a better one. And then when it's better, it replaces the old theory, and you continue with the new theory until a better theory comes by to supplant that. This is how AI machine learning works. If you take a look at AlphaGo or AlphaZero, either one, which is Google's machine learning machine for being machine, AI for being good at either Go or chess, respectively, in terms of AlphaGo or AlphaZero, you will see that the machine plays against itself. And the reason that the machine gets so good is what it does is it plays against itself millions and millions of times, and it just kind of does random things, much like evolution, and little small differences, and from that it extrapolates a strategy. Now, the problem with machine learning in general is the machines can't explain to us what the best strategy is or why the best strategy is. They can only execute, but they are really good at discovering, because it will take a person, a really long time to play a game of chess relative to a fraction of a second for AI. So this is why AI has a really big advantage. And I think that it is important in this book stack to talk about a concept, which is, I'm discussing iterative process, but I want to make a distinguishment or make a sort of distinction between an iterative process that is good and competition in general. I think people think that competition in general is truth revealing, in this sort of way. And certainly you have the competition occurring in the instance of evolution, survival of the fittest type of thing. Those with the better genes tend to propagate better than those with the worst genes, and you are competing against those that have the better genes. Fair enough. But I think that competition is the thing that often gets venerated, which is why I didn't include economic things that are really deep on the competition stuff. But instead, I think it's the iterativeness that is what is important. Just the trial, the failure, the refinement is more important than the fact that you are competing against something else. Although competition does promote a sort of leanness, I do think it is a sort of valuable mechanism, but this isn't what I wanted to emphasize with this book stack. I wanted to emphasize the iterative process. So let's get into it a little bit, and just real quick, it starts with the selfish gene, and we're going to talk about evolution. Then we're going to talk about memetics, which is effectively evolution applied to ideas. Then we're going to talk about principles. Ray Dalio leans on this pretty heavily, or he leans on evolution pretty heavily in his theories. You can tell when you read his book, if you have read Evolutionary theory before it. And then we will talk about the checklist Manifesto, which argues that checklists are a good mechanism to implement. We're getting more and more practical. And it describes, in particular, the aviation industry, which engaged in a lot of refinement and went from being very, very dangerous to very, very safe as a consequence of this refinement, utilizing checklists. And then we'll talk about Atomic Habits, which is a self-help book, but in particular, I thought it was a good self-help book for this because it talks about how a small, tiny little change, done consistently over time can make a large difference, and there's nothing that stands out as a small change making a large difference more to me over time than evolution itself, because, you have the progression from like fish to humans over the course of, sufficiently large generations. But let's get off and away and talk about, and finally, the no contest is for the balance. We'll get to that. So Richard Dawkins in The Selfish Gene puts forth an argument that evolution selects the fittest genes, and there's a bit of a sort of distinction to be made between, it's doing what's best for the individual and it's doing what's best for the gene. Genes select for what's best for the gene. And you can think of a metaphor that he uses is that humans are kind of just a vehicle for genes, and the things that are doing the evolving themselves are the genes themselves. And this is sort of, was revolutionary at the time of The Selfish Gene, at least in terms of the public discourse, and it is quite an interesting idea. It's very theoretical, but you start to understand how it's a very brutal process in terms of, it will reveal what is effective in terms of evolution, just because the raw numbers will not lie. You will get a sort of randomness in reality, where at any moment in time, any individual can succeed in terms of evolutionarily speaking. Any individual can get lucky, this sort of thing. But the progression of time, multiple generations, these sorts of things will weed out these sorts of genes that are ineffective for propagating more genes. And so any one individual can do well, but when you just examine the entire macro ecosystem and the development of a species over time, it doesn't really matter if any individual does well. What matters is the genes themselves. Okay. And I think that the complete randomness of the crossing over, in terms of genetics is also important to emphasize, because you have an iterative process where you try, you see what works, and then you, if you fail, you try, you fail, you change the process, and you try again. When we change our processes, we can do it in a directed way with informed ideas of what might work. Evolution just does it completely randomly, but it's a long scope. It's very similar to, machine learning, where it is just the sheer volume that really gets it. Okay, let's talk about memetics. And so I will click here. So memetics was initially coined by Richard Dawkins in The Selfish Gene as an idea where he was talking about everything, looking at it from the perspective of the gene and what's valuable for the gene, but he also proposed an idea that we could look at it in terms of cultural units or memes instead of genes. And a meme would spread based on the same principles that a gene would spread for, which is how good is it at reproducing? How clearly can it get reproduced? What is its fecundity, which is how fast it can spread in terms of ideas? What is its fidelity when it spreads? How close is it to the original idea? There's a few other parameters as well, but we think about this in terms of ideas, and it creates a very interesting perspective, I think, for examining ideas, where you look at the ideas and you see when an idea is prolific, there's a tendency to think that that idea is good. And usually this will be the case because a lot of people tend not to adopt bad ideas. For example, a lot of people think it's bad to jump out of a 10-story building. This is in fact the case. You don't know that it's bad from first-hand experience, but you know that it's bad, right? But a lot of things that we learn socially, for example, aren't very useful, or maybe we take for granted that they're useful, or these sorts of things, and really they're not. And so when it comes to examining ideas, an idea is very, very good at spreading. Isn't necessarily a good idea, but it does mean that it's good at spreading. So, or an idea that's popular isn't necessarily a good idea, it's just an idea that's good at spreading. So ideas that invoke a sense of danger, tribalism, sex, all these sorts of things will disproportionately spread stuff that invokes a sense of outrage. For example, if you're outraged about something, you're much more likely to talk to someone about it, which further helps to spread the idea faster. If you look at what when you like let loose the algorithm in terms of like social media and this sort of stuff, what performs really well is stuff that provokes outrage, because people are actually just very likely to share it. And so it's this idea where this isn't necessarily the most useful type of idea, but it pushes like the right types of buttons, especially the danger ones. There's a particular example that comes in mind, and I bring this up constantly, or I feel like it's constant, and I always encourage people to correct me if they can find something that disproves this. But this is the razor blades in the Halloween candy. Almost every Halloween I see reports or the mention of it on the news somewhere, at least once. I have looked every single Halloween for any instance of there being a razor blade in a child's candy. I have never come up with it once, and yet it gets mentioned every single Halloween. And the question is, why is this? It's not a sort of warning to parents that corresponds in any way to reality, as far as I can tell, because I can't find a single case of there being a razor blade in a child's candy. There is cases of razor blades in sandboxes. I think there was a case where someone put a bunch of razor blades in a sandbox, but that's a different thing. The point is that the news stations are warning parents about something that has never occurred or been reported on as actually having occurred, as far as I can tell. If anyone has a case of this, please let me know, but I always look for it. But if you look at what are the characteristics of the story, it's danger to the children, which is especially a button-pushing one. It makes it very likely to spread. It's also incredibly simple. Razor blade in candy is a very simple idea. There's no nuance there. Nuance is not very good at spreading, even though nuance is actually usually what makes a good idea. And then it's it being towards the kids specifically, and it also being timely in terms of, you can bring it up every Halloween. It's like a good thing to bring up on Halloween. I think anything that's especially seasonal or holiday oriented tends to be an idea that is easy to spread, because whenever the Halloween rolls around, it invokes these types of ideas or reminds you of them to help make the spread. So, being able to, again, this Memetics book is quite theoretical, but being able to examine ideas through the lens of, hey, the idea is spreading because it's good at spreading, not necessarily because it's intrinsically useful, I think is a good, important thing to have. Okay, well now let's start getting a little more practical with Ray Dalio. And Ray Dalio, on Memetics, by the way, just real quick, Dawkins argues that our human bodies are like vehicles for the individual genes. With memes, they make the argument that our minds are merely vehicles for the cultural unit that is the meme, and are, in some sense, slave to it. This argument is made in the book, but it's a little bit grim/bleak, but it is an interesting metaphor. Okay, moving on to Principles by Ray Dalio. You can tell that evolution informs his thinking. And what Ray Dalio argues that he's done is he has, he sorts of strips down all the practices in his business, and he tries to apply the idea of iterative processes, try, fail, refine, repeat, and tries to make it so that he focuses on the process himself. So that is to say, he looks to create systems, and systems are very practical, because he says, in this situation, we do X because in the past, we have tried all X, Y, Z, W, L, whatever, and X is the most effective strategy, so we do this. And he argues for a sort of idea meritocracy. He mentions this idea a lot in the books, with the idea that all the ideas will compete against each other, and they will be evaluated on their merit. And so this is a sort of attempt to remove any kind of nepotism from ideas. You don't look at the ideas in terms of who they came from, but you look on the merits themselves, which in a sense is a sort of, you're trying to, how should I say? With Memetics, your concern is that ideas don't necessarily spread because they're good. Sometimes they spread because, let's say, the person who's saying them is well liked via the halo effect. Well, with principles, you're trying to formulate an idea meritocracy, so you create systems such that it becomes harder for ideas to spread because of anything other than their virtue. And I think that this is an important like sort of development or way of looking at things, and where the way he couches it or like articulates it is these are the principles. So the particular way for doing a certain thing is this, and he's done it because he looks through all the previous ways, and he very clearly, analyzes it. He creates systems for keeping track of this sort of thing. Like he uses personality assessments, and he's discovered that assigning people with certain personalities to certain projects has a certain like type of outcome. So you try and assign certain types of people to certain projects as a principle, and it's about creating systems that are such that you can plug the square peg into the square box and the circle peg into the circle box, this sort of thing. And so this is very interesting. The creation of systems, I think, is you can look at systems as being like a kind of like gene or meme, where you just over time will refine the system until it gets better and better and better. And the whole point is this iterative refinement. I like this book quite a lot. You can tell that, again, it's really informed by evolution, but now we're going to start getting more towards the practical and less away from like the evolutionary biology perspective. By the way, Principles is primarily focused in business. Ray Dalio ran Bridgewater Associates, which is an investment firm. And so this is the primary way of, his primary interest. But he talks about, iterative processes to develop, the assessment of companies, for example, and like doing stuff like creating an outline of all the questions you have to ask yourself about the company, because these questions tell you important information, which moves you away from your gut or the good memes of the company and towards the stuff that really matters, which might not spread as much, bad memes, but might in fact be more informative in terms of informing your practice. Okay, next up we have the Checklist Manifesto, which I read fairly recently. In particular, I have a specific chapter in mind from the Checklist Manifesto, which is their talk about aviation. So aviation, when it first came around, or flying first came around, it was judged as being just extremely, extremely dangerous, just an impossible process. And the way that they got through this impossible process is they crashed a lot of planes. But every time they crashed a plane, what would happen is they would identify why the plane crashed, and then they would create back to Dalio, a system that would help you sort of prevent such a crash in the future. And what this system was couched in was the idea that, man, oh man, if checklists are really good. And so, and this is kind of the central thesis of the Checklist Manifesto, if it wasn't obvious, checklists are really good. And what a checklist will do is it will force you to engage in all the processes, all the little things that are really effective, that are just easy to forget. The little things might not have good memes, but doing them is an important thing. Like, for example, another thing that the Checklist Manifesto talks about is the development of checklists in surgeries, like double checking that you have all the implements you used in the procedure after the procedure's done before you sew the person up. Why might this be important? Well, it's certainly not a good meme. It's certainly not an interesting thing to do. It doesn't push any sort of buttons, but leaving a scalpel inside someone's body is a really bad look, right? If you leave a scalpel inside someone's body, that's going to mess them up. So just having a process where you have a system where you have to check a box that says, yes, I in fact confirmed that every single one of the implements I used is in fact outside their body, or, yes, I washed my hands before this procedure was another really big one. This reduced deaths a lot. It really moves the needle. And checklists are, in my mind, one of the simplest systems that's really, really, really effective, because oftentimes the really small things can make a difference. And so implementing checklists will help you make a big difference. But back to the flying, every time a plane crashed, they created a new checklist for, if you have XYZ symptom in your plane, you do XYZ things, and over time, safety got way safer. Now, in terms of flight time versus flying versus driving, it's safer to fly than it is to drive. Not miles driven, flight time versus drive time, right? Because obviously you fly way faster than you drive, but just the time in the air is safer than it is driving to the airport. Okay, so we've created a sort of theory or a more practical, the checklists are more accessible in terms of implementation, I think, than Dalio's principles, although the principles behind the principles are fairly accessible in his book in terms of, like, it's easy to understand. But being like, I should create a checklist, like, let's say you have a morning checklist and you do all these important things that are maybe not, they don't move the needle in terms of, like, what's maybe interesting to you, or they don't have good memes, as it were. Like, for example, taking a multivitamin is not particularly sexy, but being deficient in a vitamin or mineral is a pretty bad thing. You create this checklist where it includes, to take my multivitamin. This is just an example of something you can do, with a checklist. But let's look a little bit more at implementation, and here we have Atomic Habits. I wish that was a little bit more zoomed in, but by James Clear. I'm currently reading this right now. I've read it before. Big fan. It is a self-improvement book about creating or implementing habits. And a habit is just a process or a system that you engage in very consistently. And what James Clear's kind of central argument is that, small little changes over a large period of time will create enormous sorts of results. And, it's about, so the inclusion of this is more about implementation than it is the information. But I thought Atomic Habits as a self-help book was a particularly good inclusion here, because it is making this argument that it's small things, small little things done over time that create a big difference, because evolution is a small thing, and evolution is kind of, the metaphor that underpins a lot of all this stuff, or it is held up as the sort of paragon of how a sort of system of try, fail, refine creates enormous differences over a large period of time. Clear says you can do little habits that create a difference over a large period of time. If in those habits you are refining as you go and making those habits more effective, if those habits are a checklist, for example, just using a checklist as the habit, and it is informed by the idea of principles, that you take a look at what is working in this checklist and you keep that, and then you take out what's not working, the iterative refinement, you can over time create a process that's very robust for getting the types of results you want. And this is all about implementation. Some examples is like, you need to make it easier to sort of reduce the friction for the good habits, increase the friction for the bad habits. It is something you can like iteratively refine, but it's fundamentally a self-help book. Okay, all about consistency. And finally, we have For Balance, No Contest. It's been a hot minute since I've read this book, but for me it was a profound sort of book because I thought competition was inherently truth-revealing. And competition is a form of iteration, right? When you have evolution, although evolution is also competition, but when you have evolution, you get a new trial every generation, right? You get new genes, and then you throw them through the gauntlet, and the genes that do well continue on. And so anytime two forces clash, you have a sort of instance of, well, whichever one wins, this is the meritocratic, they had the better what have you, whether it's ideas, fitness, like physicality, whatever. As Dalio might put it, in, where is it here? Principles, it's an idea meritocracy, but the idea is that competition is often seen as whoever's the winning, they have the best method. So, for example, if you were doing weightlifting in the 80s with the Bulgarians, they had the best methodology. They also were on a ton of gear, but it is looking at whoever wins and saying they did it best. Often this is actually a fairly good heuristic. I'm not going to argue that it's not a good heuristic or that competition is worthless. But what Alfie Kohn does is he creates a sort of argument against competition in that it is not the competition itself that's necessarily truth-revealing, and sometimes it can actually have negative effects. I like this book a lot for balance because I think you can bifurcate competition from iterative refinement. It's the iteration and the refinement and the trying and failing that I think is important, and it is not the competition itself. And so I think that this book can help make clear why it's not necessarily the competition itself, although I don't agree with Kohn to the extent that he disapproves of competition. I do think it's an interesting and novel perspective, one that is not particularly common, which is why I included this book in the book stack. Honorable mention to the 5 elements of effective thinking, which what it does is it sort of stylizes, important pillars of thinking in terms of the elements. Like, I think there's air, earth, wind, fire, something like this. It's been a little minute since I've read it. Highly recommend 5 elements of effective thinking. But the element of fire is failing. And so the idea behind that is you have to try and fail in order to learn. And it really just underpins like the entire philosophy of this iterative processes. And maybe I really should have included it, but honorable mention to the 5 elements of effective thinking. So I think that this is a fairly good book stack for going through these ideas from a very conceptual level and then reaching a very practical level. So we'll just quickly go through it again. With the selfish gene, you get the idea of evolution, which is kind of, a very strong metaphor for the iterative processes, and just looking at, how things can come to be when it is just trial, error, repeat, refine, this sort of stuff. The stuff that works gets kept. In each generation, the stuff that's working will tend to propagate more often, and the stuff that's not working gets weeded out. Also, a book on machine learning in general would probably fit this bill, but I haven't read too many of those. Then we have Memetics, which is saying, hey, this process applies to ideas too, not just evolution, where the ideas that are going to spread are going to be the ones that are not the best ideas, but the ideas that are good at spreading. And then we have Dalio, who introduces, the important idea of an idea meritocracy. It's in the context of business, but the whole point is you should figure out systems that are good for emphasizing or sorting out what is actually effective in terms of ideas, from like what is just the ideas that are good at spreading or making cognitive errors. Another example of a book that could have been included on this is Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman, where he talks about a whole bunch of cognitive biases. This would be an example of something you would want to weed out through iteration if what you valued is the idea of meritocracy. So that's, again, Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman, another honorable mention. Then we have the checklist Manifesto, which is a bit more specific in my mind than Principles is. In regards to its prescription, they say, hey, if you want to do something well, and it's important that you do specific things like washing your hands or not leaving a scalpel inside of the patient, if you're a doctor doing a surgery, then you should have a checklist, because a checklist is something that's not particularly sexy. It has bad memes. So initially for washing your hands, that was not something that was sexy for doctors, but a checklist is really effective. And this is most emblematic or most evident in the aeronautics industry, where they've turned it from something that's really dangerous, flying a metal pipe through the sky at hundreds of miles an hour, to something that is safer than driving your car. And so that's that. And then we finally have Atomic Habits, which is the full practical, and the reason it's largely included is because the central metaphor of the book, Tiny Changes, Remarkable Results, it's the subtitle, fits very well with the whole metaphor of evolution, which is kind of where we've branched through this whole sort of narrative, where we're coming from the angle of evolution and kind of as the first principle, as it were. And then we have No Contest as a book for balance. Anytime you want to include a book for balance, you want to make sure that it sort of goes against the narrative that you have with the other books. And this one is not directly against, but what it is offering is a sort of warning against competition itself, that it is perhaps not competition that is the useful thing, but it is the iterative process itself. I think that this is the case, that it is the iterative refinement. And to be fair, competition will often force people to engage in iterative refinement where they would have just otherwise coasted. Oftentimes when you lose, that is often a point where people make reflections about what is effective, and they try and refine their processes after they lose. So I don't think competition is worthless, and I don't agree with Alfie Kohn to the extent he dislikes competition, but I do think it's a really novel and interesting sort of thing. I wish I could give a better example, but this has been the Book Stack. If anyone has a specific request for a further book stack or feedback on this, because this is the first one I've done, I think maybe I've done one more, but this is at the very least a first in a while, feel free to put it in the comments. It would be greatly appreciated, especially if it's feedback, although requests are also very much appreciated. Feel free to do the YouTube algorithm stuff, like, comment, subscribe, share, and have a good day.